The U.S. bankrupted the British Empire. The secret bill for World War II war is often imagined as fire and steel, as bullets tearing through the air, as bombs shattering stone and flesh alike. But the war that engulfed the world between 1939 and 1945 was fought in shadows far darker than the battlefields themselves. Beyond the trenches, beyond the oceans and skies, beyond the headlines of heroism and sacrifice, there was another battlefield, one of paper, ink, and invisible arithmetic. For every tank that rolled across Europe, every fighter plane that sliced through clouds, every soldier who fell in mud and blood, there was a ledger being balanced, a loan being extended, a currency devalued, and a nation's survival being weighed in numbers instead of bullets. The United States and the British Empire, allies in ideology but strangers in circumstance, were not only fighting a war of arms, but a war of economic endurance. It was not enough to supply men with weapons. The machinery of survival itself had to be maintained. Ships required fuel, armies required food, and nations required money to keep their economies from collapsing under the staggering weight of total war. Every soldier on the front line was supported by unseen hands, accountants, financiers, and ministers who calculated not the trajectory of artillery, but the trajectory of debt. Money was the hidden gun, the silent artillery, the invisible tank that could determine victory or defeat without ever crossing a battlefield. In London, the halls of power were filled with anxious voices and crumpled papers. Prime ministers and chancellors wrestled with questions that had no moral clarity. Should they send another division to France, knowing that it would drain the treasury further? Should they ration food even more strictly, risking public unrest, to save enough resources for the Royal Air Force? Every decision carried the weight of human lives. But it was not only courage or patriotism that dictated the course of action, it was solvency, credit, and the invisible promise of repayment to distant financiers. Survival was bought, measured, and balanced, just as surely as bullets were loaded and bombs were dropped. Across the Atlantic, the United States quietly transformed into the world's banker. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, was more than a strategic military program. It was a financial lifeline. Billions of dollars worth of tanks, planes, ammunition, and food flowed to Europe not as charity, but as investment in a future in which Allied victory would secure global stability, and ultimately the repayment of the moral and economic debt incurred. Britain, proud and exhausted, signed agreements under conditions that would echo through decades. The empire, which had once commanded the world's oceans and traded in gold, now relied on checks and balances, on ledgers and interest rates, on a faraway power that had not yet felt the sting of invasion or the roar of Luftwaffe bombers overhead. The costs were staggering. Every ship that sailed across the Atlantic carried not only military hardware, but the hidden price of survival. Every ton of food rationed at home represented pounds borrowed from an American treasury. Every bullet fired against the enemy came from resources purchased on credit, a promise that would one day demand repayment. Money dictated how far a campaign could advance, which weapons could be produced, which cities could be defended. It dictated strategy with a quiet, inescapable authority. While generals debated tactics, it was accountants who often delivered the final word, sometimes unconsciously shaping history with spreadsheets rather than swords. But it was not only governments and generals who felt this invisible warfare. The ordinary people of Britain bore the cost in ways that were subtle but profound. Rationing was not a mere inconvenience. It was a daily reminder that survival itself had a price. Families waited anxiously for the weekly allotment of food, stretching meager portions over days and weeks, turning simple meals into exercises in ingenuity and endurance. Mothers counted every ounce of sugar and every drop of milk. Fathers returned home from factory shifts exhausted and haunted by the thought that no matter how hard they worked, the empire's debts might never allow their children to eat well again. Hunger became an omnipresent companion, a shadow at every hearth, a reminder that war's price is paid not only in blood but in bread. In the factories, the labor was unrelenting. Men and women worked in unison with a single-minded purpose, to produce enough to keep the war machine running. Steel was rolled, engines were built, shells were forged. Every day's work was measured in output that would sustain soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the wages they earned were constantly eroded by inflation, themselves pawns in the hidden economic battles that stretched from London to Washington. People labored without seeing the balance sheets that defined their sacrifices. Yet they felt the consequence in every empty pantry, in every rationed loaf, in every cold night spent huddled under thin blankets. The economic pressures also dictated military strategy in ways that were rarely visible. Decisions about where to deploy forces, which offensives to launch, even which cities could be defended, were all influenced by the silent hand of finance. A city might be left vulnerable, not because it lacked courage or strategic value, but because defending it would consume resources that the treasury could not afford. A campaign might be delayed because the fuel, ammunition, or equipment could not be purchased without further debt. Victory, as it turned out, was often a function of accounting, a negotiation between ambition and arithmetic, between courage and solvency. Across Europe, the ripple effects of financial strain were everywhere. Nations teetered on the brink of collapse, not only because of bombs, but because their economic foundations had been shattered. Inflation consumed savings. Unemployment surged when factories could not sustain. Civilian demand and the value of money became a weapon in itself. The British Empire, once the pinnacle of global wealth and influence, found itself negotiating with a distant ally for the resources that would determine the survival of its people and its armies. Pride was subordinated to necessity. Ideology was subordinated to ledgers. War, it became clear, was a contest not only of arms but of finance, a silent struggle in which the power of money shaped the fate of nations as decisively as any general could. Every shipment, every loan, every ration reflected a deeper truth, that total war is total. In every sense, consuming not just lives but economies, not just cities but civilization. Behind the headlines of battles won and lost, behind the stories of heroism and sacrifice, there was a quieter, invisible story being written in dollars and pounds. The U.S. and Britain, allies in the fight against tyranny, were also participants in a different struggle, one in which the strength of a nation was measured not only in soldiers and artillery but in creditworthiness, in the ability to secure and sustain the financial means of survival. The war raged across continents, turning cities into rubble and fields into graves, yet there was a battle few could see, fought not with guns or bombs, but with paper and promise. In the smoke-filled rooms of London, behind polished desks and heavy curtains, a different kind of warfare took place, a war waged with signatures, seals, and silent negotiation. Britain, standing alone against the tide of Axis aggression in 1940 and 1941, faced not only enemies on the battlefield, but a crisis of survival that no sword could cut through. The empire, vast and proud, had been sustained for centuries by trade, colonies, and wealth. But now every pound in the treasury seemed to vanish as quickly as it was spent. The situation was desperate. German forces had overrun much of Europe. France had fallen, and the British Isles braced for an invasion that seemed inevitable. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas, but even it required fuel, munitions, and constant replenishment. The economy was stretched to its limits. Factories ran day and night, yet production alone could not cover the cost of war. The government had tapped every reserve, every contingency, yet the empire's resources were failing. Every day without support meant cities left vulnerable, soldiers under-equipped, and civilians facing hunger. It was in this crucible that America, a nation across the Atlantic that had not yet officially entered the war, became Britain's lifeline. The relationship between the two countries had always been complex, cultural cousins, wary partners, and ideological allies, but now it became one of survival. Behind closed doors, British diplomats and American officials negotiated agreements that would keep the war alive. These were not public acts, not declarations of glory, but secret arrangements designed to provide the empire with resources it could not otherwise afford. Lend-Lease, the program that would eventually send billions of dollars worth of food, arms, and equipment to the Allies, began as a quiet lifeline, a chain thrown across the ocean to keep Britain from sinking under the weight of its own debt. The loans themselves were astonishing in both scale and secrecy. They were carefully accounted promises backed by the implicit trust that the British Empire, if it survived, would honor them in the years to come. No headlines announced the amounts, no speeches celebrated the transfers. To the public, ration lines were long, bombings were frequent, and the war seemed endless. Yet each shipment of tanks, planes, and food was a thread holding the empire together. Every crate carried hope. Every barrel of oil carried life. The empire's soldiers marched into battle, not knowing that their sustenance. Their weapons were purchased on promises made in distant rooms, signed by men who would never see the front lines. The secrecy was necessary, Britain could not afford to show weakness to its own people nor to its enemies. Announcing that survival depended on foreign credit would have been devastating to morale, a psychological blow that might rival any air raid. Civilians needed to believe in resilience, in the empire's strength, even as ministers calculated how many weeks of fuel remained, how many bullets could be shipped, and how much bread could be rationed. Every ration card, every blackout, every factory shift was an indirect manifestation of these hidden loans. It was a war fought in kitchens, offices, and warehouses just as fiercely as it was fought in the skies over London or the beaches of Dunkirk. The negotiations themselves were tense, delicate, and fraught with moral and political dilemmas. Britain was asking for aid while maintaining its pride and sovereignty. America, cautious but increasingly committed to supporting the fight against fascism, had to balance isolationist sentiment at home with strategic necessity abroad. Every figure in these secret ledgers represented more than money. It represented lives saved, cities preserved, and campaigns sustained. Churchill himself understood that without these arrangements, the empire could crumble, not because of the enemy's power, but because of the quiet, relentless pressure of an empty treasury. The loans did not come freely. They came with conditions, expectations, and a hidden cost that would echo long after the guns fell silent. Britain's leaders accepted the assistance with grim acknowledgement that survival came at a price. The empire's sovereignty was intact, but its independence was subtly, quietly constrained by obligations far beyond the battlefield. Every pound borrowed was a thread tied not only to American support but to a future debt that would define post-war politics, economics, and global relations. To the men and women fighting in bombed-out streets or frozen battlefields, these complexities were invisible, yet they shaped every decision the empire made, from where to deploy forces, to which cities could be defended, to how much rationing civilians could endure without revolt. The human cost of this financial lifeline was immense. Civilians endured hunger and cold while the government negotiated shipments that would arrive just in time to prevent disaster. Factories ran at maximum capacity, yet wages were limited, and inflation gnawed at every household. Soldiers fought knowing that reinforcements and supplies might arrive because of loans signed thousands of miles away, not because of strategic brilliance or battlefield heroics. Families clung to hope that the next shipment of food, the next crate of ammunition, the next barrel of fuel would reach them in time, unaware of the delicate negotiations and the hidden depths that made survival possible. The logistics alone were staggering. Convoys crossed the treacherous Atlantic, facing U-boats, storms, and a mechanical failure. Each ship carried not only material but the very lifeblood of Britain's survival. Losses were devastating, yet the promise of replacement, backed by American credit, allowed the empire to continue fighting. Every delay, every sinking, every miscalculation could have brought catastrophe. Yet the empire endured, buoyed by invisible contracts, the quiet trust between governments, and the relentless pressure of necessity. The reliance on these secret loans also shaped strategy. Decisions about where to fight, how to allocate scarce resources, and which operation could be sustained were all influenced by the financial lifeline across the Atlantic. No general could plan an offensive without considering fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment, and no prime minister could commit to defending a city without calculating whether the treasury could sustain the cost. Money, in this context, was as potent a weapon as any artillery piece. It dictated action, constrained ambition, and determined which battles could be fought and which had to be deferred. In the end, these secret loans were the invisible scaffolding that kept the British Empire standing. They allowed the empire to continue fighting when victory might otherwise have seemed impossible. They maintained the war machine, supplied the soldiers, fed the civilians, and ensured that campaigns could continue. Yet with every loan came an acknowledgement that survival was not free, that the empire's endurance depended on trust, negotiation, and the silent judgment of distant financiers who held the keys to life and death in the balance. The roar of guns and the crash of bombs are the sounds most remembered of war, but beneath that thunder lies a quieter, more insidious force, one that seeps into every home, every city, and every government office. Debt and inflation are not loud, but they are relentless. They do not march across fields, waving flags, or scream over the skies in bomber formation, but they advance with an unyielding persistence, gnawing at the foundation of nations. In the years of World War II, the British Empire, a global power with centuries of influence, discovered this truth in the most intimate and painful way. The empire could withstand blitzkrieg and U-boat patrols, but it could not withstand the slow, silent weight of economic erosion. From the very beginning of the war, the cost was staggering. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies required vast sums. Every soldier sent into battle needed more than courage. They required sustenance, transport, medical care, and equipment. Factories ran around the clock, consuming raw materials that were themselves imported at extraordinary expense. Every shipment, every crate, every bullet represented money that Britain did not possess, money that had to be borrowed, promised, and carefully accounted for. Debt became a lifeline, but one with chains invisible to the eye. The empire borrowed not only to fight but to survive, and each pound borrowed drew tighter the constriction on national autonomy and decision-making. Inflation, the silent twin of debt, compounded the problem. As the government printed money to cover costs, or as more currency chased limited goods, prices rose. Ordinary citizens felt its bite in daily life. Bread became harder to obtain. Coal, sugar, and meat were stretched thin. Rationing could not fully offset the erosion of purchasing power, and family found that the same wages now bought less than they had before the war. The working class, already burdened by long shifts in factories and relentless labor, bore the weight most acutely. Every increase in production, every push to meet war quotas, was shadowed by the fact that currency itself was losing value, even as the empire spent more and more to keep fighting. The hidden costs were even greater. Debt and inflation dictated choices far beyond the home or factory. They shaped strategy, dictated priorities, and constrained ambition. Commanders could plan offensives, but their plans were bounded by what could be afforded in a world where every pound spent had to be justified against the rising tide of inflation and accumulating debt. Decisions that seemed purely tactical were in fact deeply economic. Should a division be reinforced, knowing that additional resources might have to be borrowed from the United States or diverted from domestic needs? Should cities be defended aggressively, even if maintaining them meant escalating debt or rationing civilians further into desperation? Every choice had an economic dimension, and the shadow of financial limitation was as present on the battlefield as the enemy itself. The government, working behind closed doors, was in a constant balancing act. Ministries calculated expenditures, strategists forecast needs, and ministers debated priorities, all under the relentless pressure of mounting obligations. The empire's survival depended on keeping the machinery of war moving, but every decision came with a hidden cost. Loans from the United States were critical, but they were finite and came with expectations. Domestic production could only stretch so far, and inflation meant that resources had to be continually replenished at ever-increasing prices. The empire's leaders were forced to operate in a constant state of tension, where every victory was tempered by the knowledge that the underlying financial structure was straining toward collapse. Civilians, meanwhile, lived the consequences in real time. Rationing lines stretched for blocks, and families waited for weeks. To obtain basic necessities, mothers measured portions with grim precision, while fathers returned from exhausting shifts to empty cupboards and frayed nerves. The children, often unaware of the numbers and ledgers guiding the war, felt the deprivation all the same. Hunger, cold, and uncertainty became companions as constant as the air raid sirens. Inflation was not an abstract concept. It was the gnawing emptiness of a stomach, the thinning of coats in winter, the long walks to fetch water or coal that the family could barely afford. Economic pressure was a weapon in itself, wielded silently but indiscriminately, touching every life without distinction. In the factories, inflation also shaped production and labor. Wages, although raised in some cases to keep morale and productivity high, often lagged behind rising prices. Workers produced the engines, tanks, and aircraft that sustained the war effort, yet the fruits of their labor were constantly diminished by the hidden erosion of money's value. Governments attempted to regulate prices, to control costs, to ration goods, but the dynamics of wartime scarcity and mounting debt often overpowered policy. The empire's industrial might continue to function, but at a cost felt deeply in both labor and leisure, in families and communities, in the day-to-day endurance of ordinary citizens. Debt also created long-term dependencies that subtly undermined national power. Britain's reliance on U.S. loans to fund the war effort was both a necessity and a vulnerability. Every shipment of munitions, every barrel of fuel, every piece of food was a thread connecting the empire to a distant nation, binding decisions and sovereignty in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. The empire could fight, but it did so under conditions set in distant offices by men who could influence strategy through the promise or withholding of credit. Military campaigns, previously guided by tactical and strategic consideration alone, were now measured against financial feasibility. Debt-dictated movement, constrained ambition, and, in subtle ways, shaped the empire's very identity. The erosion of national power was not instantaneous, but cumulative, quiet, and persistent. Every month of war added to the obligations owed. Every escalation of conflict amplified the pressures of inflation, and every emergency expenditure left the treasury weaker for the months and years to come. Military victories, though celebrated, could not reverse the tide of accumulated obligation. Each victory masked a growing fragility, a foundation weakened beneath the visible triumphs of guns and strategy. The empire, which had once seemed unassailable, was now walking a tightrope of financial endurance supported by loans and rationed resources, with the weight of invisible obligations pressing on every decision, every plan, every campaign. Even in diplomacy, debt and inflation played a critical role. Negotiations with allies, coordination of strategy, and international agreements were all influenced by the empire's economic condition. Britain could not commit to certain operations without considering the financial implications, just as it could not promise long-term aid to allies without first ensuring its own solvency. The empire's global posture, its ability to project power, and its credibility on the world stage were increasingly determined not by its navy, army, or air force, but by the balance of its finances, the stability of its currency, and the sustainability of its debt. The human dimension of this silent erosion cannot be overstated. Soldiers marched into battle fueled by rations and ammunition, whose arrival depended on the empire's financial health. Families endured deprivation, while the government navigated complex economic negotiations. Communities adapted, innovated, and sacrificed, often without fully understanding the invisible forces shaping their daily lives. Inflation and debt were weapons without sound, enemies without faces, yet they struck as surely as bombs, leaving wounds that would persist long after the last battle ended. Even strategic victories had hidden costs. Captured territory could not be sustained without financial resources. Gains on the battlefield were ephemeral if the infrastructure, supply lines, and production capacity could not support them. Inflation diminished the real value of resources, debt constrained decision-making, and the empire was forced to act within limits that were invisible to the public yet ever present in every policy, every allocation, every rationed loaf. The war was fought in bombed-out cities, across muddy battlefields, and over stormy oceans. But for the millions who never held a weapon, the battle was fought in kitchens, in queues, in cold homes where food was measured with trembling hands. Civilians, women, children, and the elderly endured a war of deprivation that no medal could honor and no parade could celebrate. Hunger became a constant companion, rationing a daily ritual, and the future an uncertain and fragile promise that could vanish with a single convoy lost to a U-boat or a shipment delayed by bureaucracy. Every morning, families faced the same question: what would we eat today? Mothers calculated with precision, measuring every ounce of flour, every drop of milk, every slice of bread. They became mathematicians of survival, transforming poverty into sustenance through ingenuity and sacrifice. Children learned early that sweets were rare luxuries, that meat might appear only on special occasions, and that the rhythm of life was dictated not by clocks or school schedules, but by ration cards issued by the government. Fathers returned from long shifts in factories, hands cracked and calloused, faces hollow from exhaustion, only to find that what they earned could not fully provide for the household. The arithmetic of war was cruel. Supply never met demand, and every pound of food had a hidden cost, paid in scarcity, patience, and resignation. Rationing, while necessary for survival, became a measure of control as well as endurance. Citizens were required to present coupons, to measure portions, to limit indulgence. Yet behind the bureaucracy lay human suffering, quiet and often invisible. Families improvised, soup stretched with vegetables grown in tiny gardens, bread baked with clever substitutions, milk diluted so it might last longer. The streets were filled with the sound of carts delivering coal, flour, and sugar, yet the joy of abundance was gone. The normal rhythms of life had been replaced by a constant negotiation with scarcity. Children grew up calculating portions as instinctively as soldiers calculated trajectories. Hunger was not only physical, but psychological, a gnawing, persistent awareness that survival was fragile, contingent, and entirely dependent on forces beyond one's control. Food shortages were only one aspect of deprivation. Clothing, fuel, and household goods became scarce or unaffordable. Winter arrived as a season not of celebration but of endurance. Coal for fires was rationed, clothing patched repeatedly until it was threadbare, shoes mended until soles wore thin. Houses, often damaged by bombings or stripped for scrap, were cold and damp. Families huddled together at night, bodies pressed for warmth, hearts anxious over the fates of sons, brothers, and husbands at the front. Every day was a negotiation between need and resource, comfort and survival, hope and resignation. The psychological toll was immense. Civilians were constantly reminded of their vulnerability both to the bombs falling from the sky and to the scarcity pressing at their doors. Children went to school with stomachs empty, yet were expected to focus, to learn, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Parents carried the invisible weight of responsibility, knowing that every ration, meal, and every hour of labor was a shield against hunger and despair. Communities banded together, neighbors shared what little they had, and the unspoken solidarity of survival became a lifeline as vital as any supply convoy. Yet even solidarity could not erase the fundamental reality that war had stolen normalcy, stolen abundance, and stolen the simple promise of a predictable future. Evacuations from cities under attack added another layer of strain. Children sent to the countryside, separated from families, faced loneliness, fear, and uncertainty, while parents remained in bombed cities, working tirelessly to keep their households intact. Letters were delayed, news was sporadic, and the constant anxiety for loved ones at home and at the front became a shared burden that crossed generations. Rationing and scarcity were not abstract. They were felt in every heartbeat, every delayed meal, every empty cupboard. The war reached into the most intimate spaces, altering lives in ways that would linger long after peace was declared. Even those who survived physically often paid in lost opportunity. Education was interrupted, youth curtailed by labor demands and career deferred as every citizen was co-opted into the machinery of survival. Children who might have played freely, explored, or learned trades were instead tasked with chores, garden work, or factory labor. Teenagers, barely grown, became essential laborers in factories producing munitions, food, and clothing. Futures were postponed indefinitely, sacrificed to keep the immediate needs of survival met. Dreams were deferred, ambitions shelved, and the normal trajectory of life was replaced with a constant, grinding negotiation with scarcity and rationing. The war economy also shaped social dynamics. Communities adapted in subtle and profound ways. Barter became commonplace. Neighbors exchanged goods, services, and food to cover shortages. Markets operated irregularly. Shops opened and closed depending on supply and black markets emerged, tempting some to take risks for the sake of better rations. Yet even these adaptations carried moral and psychological weight. People felt guilt, anxiety, and shame, navigating a landscape where every choice had consequence, where survival could require compromise, and where morality was constantly tested by necessity. Hunger and deprivation were compounded by the omnipresent threat of violence. Air raids, bombings, and artillery fire created a backdrop of terror that made daily life precarious. Citizens cooked meals in darkness, huddled in shelters, and carried on with routine that might be interrupted by the collapse of a building or the scream of a siren. Rationing and scarcity existed alongside the immediate threat of death or injury, creating a dual burden that weighed heavily on mental and physical health. Fear and hunger intertwined, creating a shared, pervasive sense of vulnerability. Yet even in the midst of deprivation, civilians found ways to endure. Gardens were cultivated where possible, local networks shared resources, and creativity became a weapon against scarcity. Meals were stretched, clothing mended, and homes adapted to maximize warmth and efficiency. Children learned resilience early, understanding the necessity of patience, cooperation, and ingenuity. Adults carried themselves with quiet pride, preserving dignity amid hardship. Yet, the cost was never invisible. The emotional, physical, and psychological toll of rationing, hunger, and lost futures was etched into faces, worn in posture, and reflected in the quiet moments of despair and hope that define everyday life. The war made clear that victory on the battlefield was inseparable from the endurance of civilians. Soldiers could not fight on empty stomachs, nor could factories produce without laborers who were fed and clothed. Civilians, often forgotten in the grand narratives of strategy and heroism, were the silent backbone of the war effort, carrying burdens that would not be recorded in history books. Their sacrifices, measured not in medals but in daily acts of survival, were as vital as any battle plan. Hunger, rationing, and deferred futures were the unseen front lines where the war's true cost was written. War is often imagined in the flash of artillery, the roar of tanks, and the thunder of planes overhead, yet somehow the most decisive battles were fought not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, dimly lit rooms where numbers ruled. Military strategy, the decisions that sent men to die or survive, was constrained as much by balance sheets as by intelligence reports. Every campaign, every offensive, every defensive maneuver carried with it the invisible weight of financial reality. Leaders did not simply ask whether an attack was possible. They asked whether it could be paid for, whether fuel, ammunition, rations, and replacements could be supplied without collapsing the fragile economy that supported the effort. Victory, in this sense, was as much a matter of solvency as of courage. In London, ministers pored over ledgers and calculations that mapped the limits of what could be done. Maps of battlefields hung on the walls, but next to them were spreadsheets, figures, and projections. It was not enough to know where the enemy lay or what tactics might succeed. The questions were more elemental. Could we afford to send another division across the Channel? Could we sustain a bombing campaign for months, knowing that every ton of fuel, every aircraft, every bomb had to be purchased, shipped, and maintained? Would the Treasury allow this offensive, or would it drain resources from the civilian population already stretched to the breaking point? Each military decision carried the invisible arithmetic of survival, and every soldier sent into battle was supported by a network of financial choices that would never be acknowledged in the public eye. The reality of war meant that strategy and finance were inseparable. Supplies dictated action. Troops could only advance as far as ammunition allowed, only hold positions as long as rations were sufficient. A city might be strategically valuable, yet undefendable, if it required resources beyond what the empire could sustain. Factories might produce enough tanks, planes, or artillery, but without fuel, spare parts, or trained crews, those machines would be inert. Logistics, often unseen, became the defining factor in success or failure. Battles were not simply won or lost on courage or skill. They were won or lost on weather. The economic underpinnings of the war effort could keep pace with ambition. Across the Atlantic, American credit became an extension of this strategy. The Lend-Lease Act provided vital resources that allowed Britain to project power beyond its immediate borders. Every convoy of tanks, every shipment of food and munitions, every barrel of fuel was calculated not only for its immediate tactical impact but for its place within a broader financial framework. Military campaigns could proceed because money borrowed, promised, and accounted for ensured that the empire could sustain itself. Yet reliance on foreign loans also imposed limits. Strategy could be pursued only as long as credit flowed. Decisions were subtly shaped by the anticipation of repayment, by the conditions set in distant offices, and by the knowledge that every commitment carried an obligation far beyond the battlefield. At home, the pressures were equally tangible. Civilians endured rationing and scarcity, yet these were not only matters of fairness or morality, they were military necessities. Food, clothing, fuel, and medical supplies were part of the logistical calculus that determined what could be committed to the front line. A shortage of coal might not seem like a strategic concern, yet without energy to run factories, produce steel, or transport goods, entire campaigns could stall. Every ration card distributed to a family, every barrel of oil sent to a port, was part of a larger strategy. A silent hand guiding the course of war, with an efficiency that few ever saw or appreciated. Military planners constantly confronted this interplay of finance and strategy. Decisions about timing, deployment, and engagement were influenced as much by resource availability as by enemy movements. Would an assault succeed if ammunition ran out mid-battle? Could an extended campaign be sustained without stretching the treasury beyond the breaking point? Should reinforcements be sent to one theater at the expense of another, knowing that financial and material limits made such choices unavoidable. Each calculation involved weighing human lives against pounds, shillings, and dollars. Strategy was not simply about victory. It was about survival. And survival depended on managing the invisible machinery of money as effectively as the visible machinery of war. Even the most celebrated military campaigns were constrained by economic realities. The Battle of the Atlantic, for example, was not only a test of naval skill and courage, but also a contest of logistics and financial endurance. Convoys could be protected, supplies shipped, and campaigns sustained only through careful allocation of resources, much of it dependent on foreign loans and domestic production. Losses were devastating, yet the calculations continued. Every sunken ship, every loss. Convoy represented not only human tragedy, but also financial strain, a recalibration of strategy, and a test of endurance that shaped subsequent decisions. The invisibility of these forces often concealed their influence, but it was omnipresent. Soldiers on the front line could not see the ledgers dictating their reinforcements, yet they were subject to their consequences. Generals might issue orders without awareness of every budgetary constraint, yet the outcomes of their plans were determined by what could be supplied. Cities could be defended, offensives launched, and campaigns executed only within the strict limits of financial and logistical capacity. War, in this sense, was not only a contest of tactics and courage, but also a chessboard where every move was bounded by the limits of money and resources. At the level of individual units, these realities were stark. Troops were sometimes delayed, redirected, or denied equipment due to shortages caused by rationing, inflation, or exhausted credit lines. Decisions made in high offices echoed down to the platoons and battalions, shaping their experiences and often their survival. The distribution of fuel, the timing of reinforcements, the allocation of artillery each was influenced by calculations that weighed cost against necessity, strategy against solvency. In many ways, the invisible hand of finance was as deadly and decisive as any general on the battlefield. Behind every successful campaign was an intricate web of supply, credit, and resource management. Logistics officers calculated everything from the number of bullets needed per soldier to the gallons of fuel required per tank. Planners accounted for replacement parts, maintenance, and food for every unit. Every calculation was bounded by economic realities, the funds available, foreign loans extended, the resources that could be produced domestically. Without this careful orchestration, strategy would falter, and even the most brilliant battlefield maneuvers could collapse under the weight of unmet needs. The war revealed the essential truth that military strategy cannot exist in isolation from economics. Nations can have the most skilled generals, the bravest soldiers, and the most advanced weapons. Yet without financial stability and resource management, victory becomes impossible. Britain's survival depended not only on courage and resilience, but on the careful stewardship of money, the calculated extension of credit, and the relentless balancing of priorities. The empire's leaders learned that fiscal prudence and strategic ambition were inseparable, and that the invisible decisions made in offices, banks, and ministries shaped the outcomes as profoundly as any battlefield action. The guns fell silent. The bombs no longer tore through cities, and the thunder of tanks had faded from the battlefields. Yet even as the world celebrated victory, the cost of that triumph was not measured in parades, medals, or headlines. It was invisible, etched into the lives of the living, the ruined infrastructure of nations, and the ledgers that would take decades to reconcile. Victory had been won, but it had been bought at a price few could see, and at a burden that would endure long after the last shots were fired. The human toll was staggering, though it was only partially recorded in statistics. Millions of soldiers had fallen, but millions more survived with wounds that were never entirely visible. Limbs lost, minds shattered, hearts broken by loss, fear, and the unrelenting exposure to violence. Families grieved, households emptied, and generations were shaped by absence. Children grew up with missing fathers, mothers carried the weight of households alone, and communities were fractured. Yet even for those who survived the front lines, the cost continued at home. Hunger, deprivation, rationing, and uncertainty had left their mark. The lives of ordinary civilians had been forever altered. What they ate, how they worked, and the very trajectory of their futures had been constrained by circumstances beyond their control. The economic consequences were equally profound. Nations that had once projected power across continents now faced staggering debts and crippled infrastructures. Britain, the empire that had ruled the seas and commanded global trade, was heavily indebted to the United States. Every shipment of munitions, every ton of food, every barrel of fuel borrowed across the Atlantic came with the expectation of repayment. The empire's wealth, once seemingly unassailable, had been spent in the fires of war, and the repayment of these debts would influence decades of policy, international relations, and domestic austerity. Money had become as decisive as bullets, a silent arbiter of who could rebuild, who could maintain power, and who would be left vulnerable. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Cities that had survived centuries of commerce and culture were now flattened, bombed, or scarred beyond immediate repair. Roads, railways, bridges, and ports, the arteries of industry and trade, were damaged or destroyed. Factories had been converted to munitions production, leaving civilian goods scarce. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, and schools struggled to resume normal operations. The cost of rebuilding was staggering, and it would take years for economies to regain equilibrium. Resources that might have gone to growth, education, and public welfare had been redirected to reconstruction, leaving the populace to endure continued hardship even after the war ended. The invisible cost also included lost futures. Children who grew up in rationed homes and bombed cities often faced truncated education, delayed careers, and reduced opportunities. Adolescents had worked in factories, on farms, and in civil defense roles when they might have been in classrooms or apprenticeships. Ambitions were deferred, dreams postponed, and personal development curtailed by necessity. Even as nations celebrated victory, entire generations had been shaped by deprivation and survival, carrying forward scars that were never visible but profoundly real. Inflation and debt compounded these challenges. Currency that had been devalued during the war left savings diminished and pensions inadequate. Governments faced the grim task of paying off debts to foreign lenders, often requiring continued austerity measures. Taxes rose, public spending was constrained, and civilian population continued to feel the pressure of obligations incurred to sustain survival during the war. Every ration meal, every deferred infrastructure project, every postponed social program was a reminder that victory had not eliminated hardship, it had merely shifted its form. The psychological burden was also profound and enduring. Survivors carried memories of terror, deprivation, and loss. Air raids, bombings, and the constant threat of invasion had left deep marks on the collective psyche. Families had hidden in shelters, clutched ration cards, and endured the constant fear that news of a loved one might never come. The relief of peace was shadowed by the trauma of survival, the guilt of living when others had perished, and the anxiety of rebuilding lives in a world forever changed. The invisible costs were woven into daily routines, habits, and expectations. Every cautious decision, every act of frugality, every lingering fear was a legacy of war. The economic consequences also dictated the pace of recovery. Factories that had produced tanks and ammunition had to be converted back to civilian production, a process complicated by resource shortages and skilled labor gaps. Housing had to be rebuilt, but construction materials were scarce, and the workforce was exhausted. Ports, railways, and roads needed repair to resume trade and industry. Governments faced impossible choices, balancing the immediate needs of citizens with the repayment of enormous debts. Policies were dictated not only by human need, but by the invisible arithmetic of survival, repayment, and economic stabilization. Even political power was influenced by these costs. Nations that had once wielded unquestioned influence now found themselves constrained by their economic condition. Diplomacy, international agreements, and the ability to project military power were limited by obligations incurred to finance the war. Britain, for example, remained a global presence, yet its independence in decision-making was curtailed by financial dependence on the United States. Foreign policy, military commitments, and even domestic priorities were shaped by debts and obligations that had been incurred invisibly, quietly, during the struggle for survival. The war also left lingering social and demographic effects. Many men and women had served in capacities that altered traditional roles, shifting family structures and labor patterns. Women who had worked in factories, farms, and civil defense roles often continued in the workforce, reshaping gender dynamics. Populations were displaced, cities had to accommodate returning refugees, and communities had to integrate those who had been evacuated or relocated. The societal fabric, already stretched, thin by loss and deprivation, now required rebuilding alongside the economy. Every household, every community, was engaged in reconstruction not only of physical structures but of the social and emotional bonds fractured by years of survival under unimaginable pressure. The invisible cost was compounded by the fragility of peace itself. Victory ended the immediate threat of Axis aggression, but the world remained precarious. Economic instability, political tension, and the struggle to rebuild created conditions for future challenges. Nations had to navigate reconstruction while managing obligations incurred to finance the war, while addressing the social consequences of years of deprivation, and while attempting to reintegrate populations scarred by conflict. Victory, though celebrated, was not a simple endpoint. It was a transition into a new set of struggles, shaped in part by the unseen costs of the previous struggle. Even the most visible symbols of triumph, parades, monuments, treaties could not capture these enduring costs. The medals worn by soldiers, the headlines of victory, and the celebrations of liberation were tangible reminders of courage and endurance, but they were only a fraction of the story. Beneath the surface, debt remained, economies were fragile, infrastructure was damaged, and human lives bore wounds that could not be healed by victory alone. The world had survived, yet it was profoundly altered, carrying the weight of sacrifices that were invisible, enduring, and deeply human.